They say family is supposed to be your safe haven, the people who stand by you no matter what. I used to believe that too. I used to think that blood meant loyalty, that no matter how different we were, at the end of the day, we'd always have each other. But life has a way of proving you wrong when you least expect it. My sister, Janet, and I were never particularly close growing up. We weren't enemies, but we weren't best friends either. She was the carefree one, the one who always knew how to charm her way out of trouble, while I was the responsible one, the one who did what was expected. Maybe that's why I was the one who ended up shouldering the weight of her problems when everything fell apart. It started a year ago when Janet lost her job as a copywriter. Her company downsized, and she was let go along with dozens of others. At first, she was optimistic, saying she'd find something new in no time. But weeks turned into months, and soon she could no longer afford her rent. With nowhere else to go, she turned to me. I remember the conversation vividly. She called me one evening, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I need a place to stay," she admitted, as if the words burned her tongue. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to help, but because I knew how Janet was. She wasn't the type to plan ahead, to take responsibility for her actions. Still, she was my sister, and family helps each other, right? So I said yes. She moved into our guest room the following weekend. My husband, Daniel, was supportive. He knew how much I cared about Janet, and even though he had his reservations, he never voiced them. At first, things were fine. She was grateful, helped out around the house, and even attempted to look for work. But as weeks passed, something shifted. She stopped searching for jobs, stopped contributing in even the smallest ways. Dishes piled up in the sink. Her laundry sat untouched for days. She spent her time watching TV, scrolling on her phone, or hanging out with friends who, ironically, never seemed to offer her a place to stay. I tried to be patient. I reminded myself that she was going through a hard time. But then, I started noticing the little things. Packages arriving at the door clothes, makeup, expensive skincare products, takeout containers stacking up in the trash, nights out with her friends documented on social media, while I was the one working late, exhausted, trying to keep everything together. "Janet, have you been applying to jobs?" I asked her one night as she lounged on the couch. She barely looked up from her phone. "I'll get to it when," she sighed, finally looking at me. "I just need some time, okay? I'm figuring things out." I wanted to scream, but instead, I swallowed my frustration and nodded. Because that's what I did. I carried the burden, kept the peace. Then everything changed. One evening, I wasn't feeling well. I had been nauseous all day, exhausted in a way I couldn't explain. Daniel convinced me to take a pregnancy test, just to be sure. I remember sitting in the bathroom, my hands trembling as I stared at the 2 pink lines, pregnant. A wave of emotions crashed over me, joy, fear, disbelief. I had always wanted to be a mother, but suddenly, the reality of it all hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about me anymore. I had a baby to think about. That night, Daniel and I talked about what needed to change. The nursery, our finances, our future. And inevitably, we came to the issue of Janet. "She can't stay here forever," Daniel said gently, rubbing my back. "You know that." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I know, but how do I tell her?" I knew Janet wouldn't take it well. She had gotten comfortable, too comfortable. If I told her she needed to move out, she'd see it as a betrayal. But I couldn't keep enabling her. I couldn't sacrifice my family's well-being for someone who wasn't even trying to help herself. Then, fate handed me a solution. A few days later, Caleb, Janet's boyfriend of 4 years, pulled me aside. He had just gotten a new job and was planning to propose. He wanted advice on picking a ring, but more importantly, he wanted my help. "I need to save up before I get a place," he explained. "Once I do, I want Janet to move in with me." And just like that, the answer was clear. I had a way to get Janet out without causing a fight. If she moved in with Caleb, she wouldn't feel abandoned, she'd feel like she was moving on to something better. I made him a deal. Find a place first, then propose. "I'll cover Janet's half of the rent for the first few months, until she gets a job." He hesitated, but eventually agreed. I justified it to myself. I wasn't just pushing her out. I was setting her up for success. If she had her own place, she'd be forced to stand on her own 2 feet. Within a few weeks, everything fell into place. Caleb got the apartment. He proposed. Janet said yes. And just like that, she was gone. For the first time in a year, I felt like I could breathe. But the relief didn't last long. A week after she moved out, Janet hosted an engagement party. A big one. Friends, extended family, Caleb's relatives, everyone was invited. Except me. I found out through social media, scrolling past pictures of her laughing, celebrating, toasting to her future. My chest tightened as I stared at the images, disbelief washing over me. I called her. When she picked up, her voice was cold. "Why didn't you invite me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She scoffed. "Because I don't need you there." "What? You think you've been such a big help?" she snapped. "All you did was pressure me, make me feel like a failure. You didn't help me, you just wanted to get rid of me." I felt like I had been slapped. After everything I had done, after all the sacrifices I made for her, this was how she saw me? "You're unbelievable," I whispered. "I'm done with this conversation." And then, she blocked me. I sat there, staring at my phone, my heart pounding. I had spent a year carrying her weight, making excuses for her, bending over backward to give her a life. She refused to build for herself. And in the end, I was nothing to her. Something inside me snapped. I picked up my phone and called Caleb. "I'm canceling our deal," I said, my voice ice cold. "Janet can take care of herself now." There was a pause. Then, a quiet, "I understand." And just like that, I was free. Or so I thought. At first, having Janet around wasn't too bad. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that family helps family, and that she would eventually get back on her feet. But as the months went by, something became painfully clear. Janet had no intention of helping herself. At first, I made excuses for her. She had been through a lot. Losing her job must have been hard. Adjusting to a new living situation took time. I reminded myself that she wasn't used to relying on other people, that maybe she was struggling more than she let on. But then I started noticing patterns that I couldn't ignore. She wasn't looking for work, not really. She claimed she was sending out applications, but I never once saw her preparing for an interview. Her laptop was always open to YouTube, her phone constantly buzzing with messages from friends making weekend plans. The first few weeks, I thought maybe she just needed a break, a reset. But after a few months, I started to feel like a fool. The worst part? She did absolutely nothing around the house. She treated my home like a hotel, leaving dishes in the sink, letting laundry pile up, and ignoring the growing list of things that needed to be done. My husband and I worked full-time jobs, yet somehow, she was the one who was always exhausted. One evening, I came home from a long shift to find the living room a mess. Empty food containers, soda cans, and piles of blankets strewn across the couch where Janet was curled up, scrolling through her phone. "Hey, Janet," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Would you mind cleaning up a bit?" She barely looked up. "I'll do it later." Later never came, and neither did the respect I thought a grown adult would have in someone else's home. The tension between us started to grow, slow but steady, like a crack in a foundation that no one notices until the whole house starts to tilt. I tried to talk to her about getting a job, contributing something, anything, to the house. But every time, she brushed it off. "I just need time," she'd say, as if she were owed an indefinite period of free living. "You can at least help with groceries," I suggested one night. She rolled her eyes. "I barely eat here." That was a lie. Every time I opened the fridge, my food was disappearing faster than I could keep track. My husband and I found ourselves restocking the pantry constantly, only for it to be emptied within days. And yet, Janet never seemed to have money problems. She went out with friends, bought new clothes, and treated herself to fancy coffee drinks every morning. "Where is this money coming from?" I finally asked one afternoon, unable to hold back any longer. She hesitated for a second too long. "Mom's been helping me out." I let out a breath. Of course, our mother, who had always favored Janet, was secretly sending her money every month, while I was the one covering all of her living expenses. I should have been furious, but honestly, I just felt drained. I had given her a place to stay, supported her, defended her, when my husband suggested it was time to set some boundaries. And yet, she still didn't see the problem. "Janet, you need to get a job," I told her firmly. "I can't keep covering for you. You're not even trying." She scoffed, brushing past me to grab her purse. "Why are you always on my case? I'll figure it out." But she never did. Then, life threw me a curveball I hadn't seen coming. I found out I was pregnant. The moment the test turned positive, everything changed. Suddenly, my priorities shifted. I wasn't just responsible for myself anymore. I had a future to think about, a child who would need space, stability, and parents who weren't constantly stressed about money. Janet had to go. I spent days agonizing over how to tell her. I knew she wouldn't take it well, and part of me dreaded the inevitable blow-up. But just as I was working up the courage, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Janet's boyfriend, Caleb, had a plan to propose. He approached me one afternoon, nervous but excited, asking for help picking out a ring. I liked Caleb. He was a good guy, hardworking, and clearly cared about my sister. But when I asked him about their future plans, he admitted something that made my heart sink. "I want to propose," he said, "but I don't have a place yet. I need a little more time to save." That was when an idea formed in my mind, a solution to my problem. What if you get a place first? I suggested. Move in, propose, and then invite Janet to live with you. He hesitated. I don't know if I can afford it right away. I'll cover Janet's half of the rent for the first few months, I offered, just until she finds a job. I didn't tell him my real motive, that I was desperate to get her out before my second trimester, before my house became even more cramped and stressful. But in the end, it didn't matter, Caleb agreed. Within weeks, he found an apartment, signed the lease, and popped the question. Janet was thrilled. She packed her bags and left with barely a second glance in my direction. I should have felt guilty. Maybe part of me did. But mostly, I felt relief. Finally, I could breathe again. Little did I know, the real betrayal was yet to come. For a few weeks after Janet moved out, I finally felt some peace. My home was quiet. My stress levels dropped. And for the first time in months, I didn't have to tiptoe around someone who treated me like a free hotel. My husband and I started making real plans for the baby, turning Janet's old room into a nursery, painting walls, assembling furniture. Life felt good, stable. I should have known it wouldn't last. It started with small things, messages from our mother, checking in more frequently than usual, a few vague comments about how Janet was settling in, but going through a rough time. I didn't think much of it at first. I had done my part. Janet had a place to live, a fiancé who loved her, and a safety net. She was someone else's responsibility now. Then came the engagement party. I didn't even know about it until I saw the photos on social media. A beautifully decorated venue, Janet in a designer dress, smiling as she clinked glasses with friends and family. Family that included our mother, aunts, cousins, everyone except me. I stared at my phone, my chest tightening. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she forgot. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate. I sent Janet a message, keeping it simple. Hey, saw the pictures. You didn't invite me? She read it immediately but didn't reply. Minutes passed. An hour. Then finally, a response. Didn't think you'd care. I blinked, rereading the words over and over. I had housed her for a year, paid for everything, even arranged for her to have a smooth transition into her new life, and she didn't think I'd care? I called her. She picked up after a few rings, sighing like I was an inconvenience. What do you want? Are you serious, Janet? I let you live with me rent-free for a year. I helped you. And this is how you treat me? She laughed, actually laughed. Help me. You were a nightmare to live with, always nagging me about getting a job, acting like I was some kind of burden. Honestly, I didn't invite you because I didn't want to deal with your negativity. My grip tightened around my phone. My negativity? Janet, I gave you everything. I even made sure you had a place to live after you left. Oh, please. You didn't do that for me. You did it to get rid of me. Don't act like you were being some kind of saint. My mouth went dry. I had known Janet could be selfish, but this was something else entirely. You're unbelievable. Whatever, she said. I don't want to do this right now. Just leave me alone, okay? I'm done with all of this. And then she hung up. I stared at my phone, stunned. The sister I had taken care of, protected, bent over backward for, had just tossed me aside like I was nothing. And as if that wasn't enough, she blocked my number. I sat on the couch, numb. My husband walked in, took one look at me, and frowned. What happened? I told him everything, my voice shaking with anger. By the time I finished, his expression had hardened. Cancel the rent payments, he said simply. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. What? You heard me. If she wants nothing to do with you, then she gets nothing from you. No more helping, no more paying her way. Let Caleb deal with it. At first, I hesitated. I had promised Caleb I would cover Janet's share for a few months, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized why should I? Why should I continue supporting someone who had made it crystal clear that she didn't appreciate me, didn't respect me, and didn't even consider me part of her life? So I called Caleb. Hey, what's up? He sounded cheerful, oblivious to what had just happened. I took a steady breath. I'm canceling the rent deal. I won't be paying for Janet anymore. There was a beat of silence. Wait, what? I thought we had an agreement. We did, I said coolly. But considering Janet just told me she wants nothing to do with me, I don't see why I should be financially responsible for her. She's your fiancé, Caleb. You take care of her. He exhaled sharply. Look, I get that you two had a fight, but… No, I interrupted. This isn't just a fight. She's been using me for months, and I finally see it for what it is. I don't owe her anything. He muttered something under his breath. So what am I supposed to do? I can't afford the full rent yet. That's not my problem. You should have thought about that before proposing. I hung up before he could argue further. The fallout was immediate. Janet unblocked me just to unleash a storm of messages, calling me every name in the book. Mom called too, demanding to know why I was ruining Janet's future over a petty argument. She called me an idiot. Mom. She said I was no help at all. After everything I did for her. She didn't mean it, Mom argued. She's just stressed. No, Mom. She meant every word. And you know what? I'm done. She's not my responsibility. She has you. She has Caleb. Let them deal with her. Mom was silent for a long moment. Then she sighed. This is embarrassing for the family. That was when I knew she wasn't upset about what Janet had done. She was upset that it looked bad, that people might find out how broken our family really was. Well, good thing I'm not part of that embarrassment anymore, I said, and hung up. For the first time in years, I was free. The tension between Janet and me had reached its peak. After the engagement party incident, where she had not only excluded me, but also insulted me. When confronted, I thought I was finally free of her. I had spent a year supporting her, giving her a place to stay rent-free, and now she had decided I was nothing to her. That was fine. If she wanted nothing to do with me, I would return the favor. But things were never that simple, were they? My mother had called me several times since the fallout. At first, I ignored her. I needed space, and I wasn't in the mood to hear her defend Janet's actions. But as the calls persisted, my guilt started to creep in. I finally answered, expecting some kind of reconciliation. Instead, she accused me of being cruel and unreasonable. Janet is young, she reasoned, as if that excused her selfish behavior. She was struggling, and you made it even harder for her. You should have talked to her instead of manipulating her into moving out. That was the part that hurt the most. My mother saw my carefully planned actions as manipulation instead of a necessary strategy. If I had directly told Janet she needed to move out, she would have resisted. She would have fought it every step of the way. And yet, here was my mother, making me feel like I was the villain for handling things the way I did. And canceling the rent agreement with Caleb? That was just petty, she added. Petty? I clenched my jaw. I had been nothing but generous to Janet, even extending that generosity to Caleb. And yet, when I pulled back my help after Janet's cruel words, I was the one in the wrong. I stayed silent, letting my mother's words wash over me. There was no use arguing with her. She had already made up her mind. In her eyes, Janet was the struggling victim, and I was the ungrateful, vengeful sister. After that call, I decided to cut contact. No more answering my mother's calls. No more allowing her words to twist my perception of reality. I had done nothing wrong, and I wasn't going to let guilt dictate my life. But life had a way of forcing interactions upon you, whether you wanted them or not. 2 weeks later, Janet unblocked me and sent a message. I'm sorry for what I said. I was overwhelmed. Can we talk? I stared at the message, debating whether to respond. After everything, after the way she had treated me, did she really deserve a second chance? Caleb called me a few days later. Unlike my mother and sister, he was calm, rational. Look, I understand why you're upset, he said. But Janet regrets what she said. She didn't mean it. And honestly, I'm in a tough spot now that the rent agreement fell through. I'm not saying you owe me anything, but I would appreciate it if we could at least talk. For a brief moment, I considered ignoring him, but Caleb had always been a good person. He had been there for Janet when no one else had, and he had even supported my plan to get her to move out. Fine, I agreed. Let's talk. But just you. We met at a small coffee shop downtown. Caleb looked exhausted, like the stress of the past few weeks had taken its toll. I'm not asking you to forgive Janet overnight, he said, but she's trying, and I still need a little help. Just until she gets a job, I sighed, stirring my coffee. Caleb, you know I didn't cancel that deal to hurt you. It was about Janet. She made it clear she didn't need me, so I acted accordingly. I know, he said quickly. I get it. But I'm asking for your help, not hers. I thought about it for a long moment. Fine, I finally said. I'll continue covering her half of the rent. But if she finds a job, I expect every cent paid back. Caleb nodded, relief washing over his face. That's fair. Thank you. As I left the coffee shop, I felt conflicted. Part of me was still angry, still bitter over everything Janet had said and done. But another part of me knew that Caleb was innocent in all of this. He had just been caught in the middle. That night, Janet messaged me again. Thank you for helping Caleb. I know I don't deserve it. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready for that yet. But maybe, just maybe, I will be one day. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than ever after my mother left. Even though I had stood my ground, a part of me still ached. Family had always been complicated, but now, it felt like I was severing something that could never be mended. And yet, I knew I had no choice. I had spent too long being taken advantage of, and I wasn't about to let them pull me back in. Days passed, and I tried to focus on my own life. My pregnancy was progressing, and despite everything, I found joy in preparing for my baby's arrival. My husband was incredibly supportive, making sure I didn't overwork myself. I spent my evenings researching baby names, looking at tiny clothes, and daydreaming about what life would be like once I held my child in my arms. For the first time in a long time, I was thinking about my future instead of my family's problems. Then, out of nowhere, I received a message from Caleb. Hey, I know things are tense, but I just wanted to say thank you again for helping me. I know Janet messed up, but I don't want things to be awkward between us. I stared at the message for a long time. Caleb had always been kind, and I knew he wasn't to blame for Janet's actions. Still, I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep any connection to that part of my past. After a deep breath, I responded, I appreciate the message. I hope things are going well for you. That was it. Short, neutral, no invitation for further conversation. He replied with a simple, take care, and that was the end of it. But life had a way of throwing curveballs when I least expected them. A week later, Janet showed up at my door. I almost didn't answer. I had made my decision to cut her off, and I didn't want to be dragged back into another emotional mess. But curiosity got the best of me. When I opened the door, she looked different. Not just physically, but in the way she carried herself. Her usual confidence had dimmed, replaced by something softer. Hesitation. Regret. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I crossed my arms, keeping my expression neutral. What do you want, Janet? She let out a shaky breath. I owe you an apology, a real one. I stayed silent, waiting. She looked down, wringing her hands together. I was awful to you. I took advantage of your kindness, and when I didn't need you anymore, I cut you off like you didn't matter. That was wrong. You didn't deserve that. I swallowed hard. This was the first time Janet had ever admitted to her mistakes. I don't expect you to forgive me, she continued, but I needed to say it. And I got a job. I started saving. I want to pay you back. Every cent. I hadn't even thought about the money. At that point, I had accepted that I would never see a dime of it again. But here she was, offering to make things right. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. Why now? She gave a sad smile. Because I finally realized what I lost. You were the only one who really looked out for me, and I threw that away. Something inside me softened, just a little. I don't know if we can go back to how things were, I admitted. But I appreciate you coming here. She nodded, blinking back tears. I'll send the first payment next week. After she left, I sat on my couch, staring at my phone. It wasn't closure, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, people could change. But I wasn't ready to let my guard down just yet. As the weeks passed, I found myself slowly adjusting to my new reality. My daughter was growing each day, her tiny hands reaching out, her giggles filling the house with warmth. Every time I looked at her, I reminded myself that this was what mattered. Not the past, not the conflicts, but the future I was building for her. And for myself. Janet kept her promise. She visited regularly, never once bringing up the past unless I did. It was an unspoken agreement between us. We were trying, both of us. She adored my daughter, and in return, my daughter adored her. Seeing them together softened something in me. Perhaps after everything, we could truly start over. Mom, too, stayed consistent in her efforts to rebuild our relationship. She visited once a month as we had arranged, and though it was still a little awkward at times, it was better. She never pushed, never demanded. She seemed to finally understand that I needed to heal at my own pace, and for that, I was grateful. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching my daughter nap in her stroller, Janet joined me, carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed me one and sat down beside me, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You know," she started, stirring her tea absent-mindedly, "I used to think you had it all figured out, that you were just better at life than I was." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Because it sure didn't feel like it on my end. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I know, but I see it now. You were struggling too, just in a different way. And instead of asking for help, you just handled it. Meanwhile, I ran from responsibility, expecting everyone else to pick up the pieces for me. I stayed quiet, letting her talk. It was rare to hear her reflect like this. When you cut me off," she continued, "it hit me hard. At first, I was angry. I thought you were being cruel, but then I realized you were just done. And honestly, you had every right to be." I sighed, setting my cup down. "I never wanted to shut you out completely. I just needed to protect myself and my family." She nodded, her expression serious. "I get that now, and I'm sorry it took me so long to grow up." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in a long time. She wasn't the entitled, lost girl who had drained me emotionally and financially. She was just my sister, someone who had made mistakes, but was trying to make things right. "I forgive you," I said finally, "but let's not waste time dwelling on the past. Let's just move forward." Her eyes glistened, but she quickly blinked the emotion away. I'd like that. From that day on, something shifted between us. We weren't just tolerating each other, we were rebuilding something real. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. As for Mom, our relationship remained steady. She had her moments, occasional passive-aggressive comments, or unsolicited advice, but I had learned to set boundaries, and to her credit, she respected them. One evening, while putting my daughter to sleep, my husband found me sitting quietly in the nursery, watching her breathe softly in her crib. He sat beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he murmured. I exhaled, leaning into him. I never thought things would turn out this way. That Janet and I would actually be okay again. That Mom would finally see me, really see me. It's surreal." He squeezed my hand. "You fought for this. You fought for yourself. And look where you are now." I smiled, pressing my forehead against his. "I guess I did." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had happened. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, but also the growth, the forgiveness, the love that still remained beneath it all. Family is complicated. People make mistakes. But sometimes, just sometimes, they find their way back to each other. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace.